The only thing that's there is the characters and the bare bones, which is like girl gets turned into old woman, has to seek refuge in this like evil wizard's castle moving house. So it is in fact
Howl's moving house.
Oh, God.
Well, hello, and welcome back to Gateway to Anime. How are you all? What's going on? We are the podcast where we bring you the best new anime recommendations as well as deep dive into the classics. And today we are doing just that. With me is my co-host and sister, Charlotte, and as well as that, our very special guest, our most returning guest, Gerald Lillywhite, here today to talk about the storytelling of Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki. Gerald, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks so much for having me back.
Pleasure. Charlie, how you going?
Yeah, good. So I was just taking back, you introduced me as your sister in the intro and it made me laugh for some reason.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't often do that.
I mean, where's the lie? But sure.
Yeah, well, you know.
Thank God everyone now knows that.
After all this time.
Fuck,
Yes, we indeed. We are siblings.
reveal.
You must be having a good week. Even after all this time, you're getting closer.
I am good though. Yes, excited to be back with our favorite guest. No, sorry, that's mean to all the other guests we've had. You're all equal in our hearts if you're watching this, all the guests we've had on. But one of our fan favorites, Gerald, is here.
Absolutely. And I am, of course, your host, Sam. And if you like what we're doing, you can find us on our social media platforms. They are, of course, Instagram, TikTok. You can watch us on YouTube. And if you're listening to us via the podcast, you can go and give us a review on Spotify and or Apple. Really does make a massive difference. If you really like what we're doing, you can indeed find us on Patreon, where for as little as $1.50 a month, you can really help us put this show together. You get special episodes, early releases, behind the scenes footage. Head over to our Patreon if you really like what we're doing to help us out. But as I've said, today we are here to talk about Studio Ghibli. Now, we have talked about this in the past, and obviously it comes up all the time. But I kind of realized, I'm talking to Gerry and Charlie, that like the last time we did it was 4 years ago, back in the day with Brett, where we did Studio Ghibli versus Pixar, isn't on YouTube. So if you want to listen to it, you got to go listen to it on the podcast platforms, because that's how long ago this was. So as a result, as Ghibli is the ultimate gateway for so many people, and something which transcends anime in many ways, transcends borders, transcends storytelling, transcends almost everything. Studio Ghibli has such a special place in the hearts of so many people, myself included, and of course, you, Gerald. So we're going to take a little bit of a different route in talking about this today, because what's there to be said about Ghibli that hasn't already been said? My God, everyone has incredible things to say about it. There are theses out there, left, right, and center. Everyone has something amazing to say about Studio Ghibli. But because Gerald here is an excellent writer and storyteller, what we're going to do is talk about Miyazaki specifically, Miyazaki's approach to storytelling. So Gerald, first of all, before we dive too deep into the nuts and bolts, first of all, tell me how much Miyazaki means to you as a storyteller.
Sure. I mean, the top line's really easy. Miyazaki is my hero. I have a collection of people that, that are very near and dear, but Miyazaki is number one. I think what he and his collaborators at Studio Ghibli have done for storytelling is almost unmatched in anyone I've seen in my lifetime. And as we'll get into today, he and they are so singular in the way that they go about things. Really inspiring. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into it.
Absolutely. Charlie, now, we haven't spoken about a Ghibli film for a while, except for the fact that you did, and it's on our YouTube, you can check it out, very highly, one of our more highly viewed videos, obviously about The Boy and the Heron, which is, of course, Miyazaki's latest film. He's said to be his last, but it won't be, because there never are. I think he's got another one in the works. But what does Miyazaki mean to you and Ghibli? Where did it happen in your genesis of an anime fan and follower? Whereabouts? What was the first Ghibli film you ever watched?
Spirited Away, and I watched it on a family holiday with you and our grandma. So it was really just honing in on the sibling theme. I'm like, we have a grandma, we share. I don't know what that was. I'm so sorry. Anyway, we watched Spirited Away, and I think I was like, what the hell was that? Because I was a child, but I also was very much taken with the magical storytelling. And I was like, wow, the storytelling of Miyazaki. No, I wasn't.
As an 8-year-old.
12 or 8, I don't know. But I was genuinely taken with the world. And obviously, you know, as we talk about, Spirited Away is one of the first isekais. So
absolutely it is, yeah, no question.
It's where it all went downhill from there. Started on a high note in that genre. But I think, yeah, for me, obviously, it is one of the few animes that I could talk to with my, one of the few kind of anime studios and movies, and Studio Ghibli was universally kind of accepted as excellent filmmaking, and people watch it even if they weren't anime fans. So really, it's something that I can talk about with a lot of people. And I found that instead of being like, do you watch this ninja show like that I'm watching through pirated DVDs? Like I could be like, did you see this, you know, Oscar award winning film Spirited Away? And most people would say yes. And we talk about that. And obviously we've talked about his popularity kind of transcends into mainstream film lovers. People who don't like anime will still probably like a lot of Hayao Miyazaki's films.
Absolutely.
And later on, I did do a review on The Boy and the Heron, and I want to talk to you about this later when we kind of get to the end of the episode, because I think we have differing opinions on that movie. And I don't know, we'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at The Boy and the Heron in the context of his filmmaking career as a whole, because, yeah, he does something completely different. He comes at core themes in a completely different way. And for a filmmaker, as a little tease, who is famous for catharsis and for delivering the feels. This is a film that, you know, is an old man having an opinion on that, in my opinion. So, yeah.
We'll get into that one.
Yeah. We will certainly come back to that debate. But I guess we need to start here with what is it, do we think, and this is putting it to the table, what is it that makes Studio Ghibli so special and something that does transcend boundaries and borders, and even when you say with anime, but even just with animation, full stop, because a lot of times so many people, and it's one of the reasons we started this podcast, is that so many people just view animation as either comedy or for children, right? That's it. That's the box that so many people in the West put animation in any form, whether it's Japanese, US, Russian, doesn't matter. That's the box in which many animated works get placed. Now, there is something very fantastical and magical and childlike about Studio Ghibli films. Almost so many of the protagonists are young women, in particular, young girls and young boys, but young characters, right? So there is an element of storytelling which appeals to children. My Neighbor Totoro, of course, being one that comes to mind. But of course, when you start going beneath the surface, there's so much more there. But what is it you think, generally speaking, before we dive deep, is so interesting and special about how this speaks to such a broad audience?
It's a really good question, because I think whether you can put language to it or not, we're going to really try. I think it's undeniable that there's something happening within Miyazaki films that, despite being, you know, in a particular way kind of niche, are famous for connecting with a wide range of audiences. We know by virtue of this podcast and other things that it can be difficult to get people to watch foreign language films. And here is a man who has become, with his company, just in the popular consciousness, ubiquitous. That by virtue of itself is incredible. And so for me, and again, I do want to keep stressing that a lot of this is like, I don't think our goal is to be like, here's 10 things that's going to like make Miyazaki, you know, because so much of that exists in the internet and it's useful. But to me, one of the most engaging things about Miyazaki is that even after, you know, 10 plus years working in the Australian film industry, having an adult life that I can honestly say every working day of almost my adult life has been dedicated towards story, you still don't feel particularly qualified to talk about Miyazaki. And the parallel that I'd give it is like, imagine you're a physicist in the 50s, you know, and like, you know how the universe is put together. Like, you can do some math. And then Einstein's over there coming up with the theory of relativity. And even though you supposedly speak the same language, here's this guy that has turned that language foreign. And it may take, you know, time for you to be able to understand how he got there in terms of the math, but you'll never be able to speak to how he came up with that, really. And to me, that's how I feel about Miyazaki, you know, that there's this mountain and there's mist and you're peering up, and maybe the sum of your experiences can allow you to glean a little bit of the outside, but any attempt that I would make to analyze and define, I feel lessens truly what makes him so singular. So to answer your question with more abstractions, like, to me, what is so special about Miyazaki films and about Ghibli as a whole is that they provide the most single thing that I think stories provide the human race. So to get into that, you kind of got to ask the question seriously that doesn't often get asked, which is like, why story? Like, what is the point? You know, like, what is the point of it? And we live in a culture that really drives this idea as story as entertainment. You know, it's like, what's your genre? And like, you know, talking about anime, that is, you know, like, oh, I like romance anime, or I like shonen, or I like this. And, you know, what is entertaining to you? What are you prepared to pay for? And that's a really like valid take, because we want to be entertained in all the things, right? But my fear is that that definition makes stories feel disposable. You know, it's like you could take them or leave it. But I think in our heart of hearts, on a deeper level, we understand that it's not disposable. And so then, okay, if it's doing something deeper, what is it? Some people point to escapism and they say, well, story is a way to like leave life behind for a little bit. And I think that's fair. I think, you know, I just watched the last episode of Demon Slayer of the weekend, and as a bit of escapism and entertainment, boy, oh boy, you know, 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10.
You know, so that is totally valid as well. But on a deep level, I think what story gives is not so much about where it takes us away from to what it gives. And so this has all been a bunch of burying the lead, but my view on story, which again is just my opinion, is that it is a tool that humanity has always used to safeguard a hope that we need in traversing this, you know, very unusual existence that we found ourselves in, to a tool that we use to hold on to the hope that despite what our eyes and ears may tell us with each of our excursions into the world, that there can be meaning, and that we are told that's life. Life's not meant to be fair. You know, this, that, the other. And we're all adults. We can deal with that. We feel and understand what the reality of life is. But at the same time, in our heart of hearts, we also hope that things are going to work out, that the sum of our actions may connect to outcomes, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that what story does, and why, despite all of these other types of things we can do with our time, humanity has always gravitated around this thing that restores and keeps alive that hope that we have within ourselves. And I think what this definition of story is leaning towards is this idea of story as nourishment. And I think what a Miyazaki film does better than anything else I've ever encountered is deliver that nourishment in this particular way. And, you know, there's a few really key ways that I think that happens, and all of it is, you know, mists on the mountain level of how did Einstein do it? Mm-hmm. I'd love to get into it with you, but for me, that is the like clearest answer I can give. If story is about nourishment and rekindling this hope that we all secretly keep alive in ourselves, that life and the world can have meaning, despite, you know, the world, we don't have to go into it, like it's a tricky place. Mm-hmm. Miyazaki films deliver that more than anyone else.
Absolutely. I want to put a quote here to help make this point from Miyazaki himself, and that is, I do believe in the power of story. I believe that stories have an important role to play in the formation of human beings, and they can stimulate, amaze, and inspire their listeners. He's doing something very different, and we're going to get into structure and the difference of structure that is utilized by Miyazaki in a lot of Asian storytelling, and particularly Japanese. Yeah, there is just something about it. And we see this in a lot of our favorites, right? And we talked, obviously we had you on for the Cowboy Bebop episode. And there's something we talk about all the time with that, which what is so special about Bebop is how he manages to capture the in-between moments of life, which in many ways are the real cornerstones. It's very easy, especially in Western storytelling, to be like, you know, the huge climax and this giant thing which has been building up the whole time. Yeah. Of course those things are important, right? But those moments in between are really the moments that actually shape you, because they're the things that happen all the time. Yeah. As they say in philosophy, we are what we repeatedly do, you know? And so as a result, I think that is something to do with what makes this very special. What do you reckon, Charlie?
Yeah, it's just shocking that Gerald had exactly what I was going to say written down there. I don't know how he came to that exact. No, I agree with both of you. I also think, I genuinely agree. And I'm excited to get into structure and how it kind of works on that level and kind of tease it out, because I think there's a lot in there to talk about.
There is a lot, an awful lot. But just very quickly, now in our earlier episode with the Ghibli versus Pixar, I've talked a lot about how the studio was formulated and created and how it all began. Not really going to do that today, but very, very, very quickly, just for those of you who aren't aware, but Flash Notes, it was founded in 1985 by director Hayao Miyazaki, along with Sayo Takahata, Toshio Suzuki, and Yasuyoshi Takuma. So those are the 4 founders of Studio Ghibli. Now, obviously, Miyazaki was the main auteur the whole time, but actually Takahata in many ways was the mentor in the early days. Suzuki, the producer, and also so was Takuma. And it's just really interesting that obviously in many ways people find Ghibli synonymous with Miyazaki. Not entirely true. Obviously his son is now working there, Goro. Miyazaki's made 3 films. Takahata made 5 films. Takahata tended to make more adult films. Of course, his most famous being Grave with the Fireflies, one of the saddest pieces of media in any form ever made. So what's interesting about Miyazaki, and I think one of the reasons why he's such a unique storyteller, and this is a quote from Takahata. This will help us get into structure and how he does, this sort of black magic that you talk about, which I think, in some ways is a bit of a cop-out with like this idea of like human genius, and it's like, it's just something beyond the pale, and it's always very masculine and male-dominated. There's no question there's elements of genius here with Miyazaki, no question, but I do sometimes find that narrative a touch toxic. But Takahata said in the 2000s, he said, Hayao Miyazaki stopped writing screenplays a long time ago. He doesn't even bother to just finalize the storyboards. After diving into the process, he then begins to create storyboards while doing all his other work, from key animation on down. Using his powers of continuous concentration, the production starts to take on elements of an endlessly improvised performance. Now, that is fascinating.
It is one of the most singular working processes for any kind of filmmaker working at his scale on the planet. There is no question there, that this is a process and a method of filmmaking where, he's on the record talking about this process whereby he'll find a single image, usually underpinned by a very a powerful emotion, usually underpinned by a very personal experience. And he might carry this imagining around for like 10 years. So an example that he's given us is a girl standing in the rain with an umbrella next to a fantastic creature, right? Or a little girl taking her first train ride by herself and the emotion and feeling of that coming of age experience of realizing you're out in the world and having to, do things at your own. So, Totoro and Spirited Away began with this very specific, emotional, personal germ of an idea. And then, as you say, instead of writing a screenplay, which is the way that 99.9% of all films are made, especially ones that are funded and are part of different studio systems, he just starts to draw, and the faith that his producers have, and they're on record as well, being like, very early on, I just discovered that this man's a genius and this is how we're going to do it. And that's how it's going to be. But to just decide to very organically let story drive for there is very, very special. And I think the reason that he can do that, and this is to take one step back from process to look at the what for a second, is that he is almost the preeminent humanist filmmaker. And by that I mean, if we look at that definition of story whereby people have a cathartic experience when disorder turns to order, when story tricks something as sophisticated as the human mind into believing that this meaning can exist, right? But there are all manner of meanings that story can leverage. Religion is a story. Politics is a story. Tarantino saying revenge is meaning is a story, right? And none of these things are inherently bad or negative, but you can see how in different contexts, maybe things take certain shades. Miyazaki's philosophy and what he puts at the heart of his disorder to order meaning, his definition of story, is this very clear purpose of humanism, and you see it in his films, this idea that the greatest thing that you can do is care for another, or to be worthwhile of care for another, you have to work hard and contribute to the community, or humanity probably shouldn't just torch the environment, and so it is a very humanist view. And there's a beautiful contradiction that you get with Miyazaki of the image of the old man looking weary, smoking a cigarette, being very pessimistic, who has nevertheless made some of the most endearingly humanist films the world has ever seen, right? Yes. And so it is one thing to say, it's oh, okay, humanism, right? Super easy just to be like, hey, Charlie, maybe we shouldn't torch the environment. Maybe we should be nice to each other. But the way in which Miyazaki can take people as cynical as us, well, as cynical as me, and,
accurate.
No, that's fair.
and reduce me to tears because he's made me remember that like the world isn't a horrible place, or you do have power to be a better person and change things and all the rest of it. Like that's a really difficult thing to do, and this is where we get to process, right, whereby human beings are very sensitive to artifice in our films. How often do we go to the movies and we say to ourselves, I knew it was going to happen, and so whatever meaning of message or whatever is inherent in that is lessened by that artifice.
Yes.
Studio Ghibli films have no artifice, and it goes to this process. He doesn't even know what's going to happen next. How can, they talk about the process where like he'll be changing the ending weeks before. Like I saw an interview where he's talking about The Wind Also Rises, and there's one final scene where the protagonist is seeing in this like imagined version of the afterlife his wife who had passed, and in the first draft she says, "Come to me." And then Miyazaki realized that no, what was true to his purpose, what was true to his humanism was you have to go live. You have to keep fighting. You have to keep trying. And so he changed the ending. And so at the final moment, the whole meaning of his film changed, and he's just given such freedom to work like that. And so I guess like I also want to stress from a storytelling perspective that kind of organic storytelling isn't allowed to exist.
Yes.
It's just not allowed to exist at that scale.
No.
Like an analog of a film series that might be trying to be humanist is Marvel. Heroes are going to save the day. If you try real hard, things can be better. Let's stand up to the bullies in life. But those films are genre driven. They're often by necessity, written by multiple people. Producers are across the process. It's just not allowed to happen. And then partner to this idea that here's this man making humanist stories, and why don't we all do that? It's because it's really hard to be sincere, and to really just go all in. Even Marvel films that are trying to do that, they still undercut themselves all the time with this bathos, where they never allow themselves to get too sincere. A joke always undercuts it or something.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, true.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of what makes him so singular, that old man with the cigarette who's willing to go to the wall for this philosophy that he has on story. And even though he doesn't believe it all the time, this is what he's dedicated his life to. And to me, that is heroic. And it's not so much to do with the imagining of the male genius being in pain and pushing through anyway. It's this view that he has that he's trying to do a version of his right thing, or trying to hold on to that. And I've got these quotes here that illustrate that. Where it's Miyazaki said that the mission of his work was to comfort you, to fill the gap that might be in your heart of your everyday life, right? Which I am interpreting as like us all trying to construct the meaning and find the narrative within ourselves of our own life. But then, because he's always in a push and pull, he says, rather than watch my film 50 times, children should be doing something else for 49 of those times. During the 49 repeat viewings of Princess Mononoke, they're losing out on something, and the adults don't realize that something can't be regained. And so he kind of pushes and pulls between wanting his films to matter to being dismissive of the way they could matter. You should just live your life.
On process and how kind of, I feel like when you're talking about comparing kind of Marvel and Ghibli, I feel like it's like, I don't want to get too stuck on this point, but obviously he's afforded that because he's essentially an auteur, like the idea of being able to do your own process in a way that is not kind of so studio run like we do see in Hollywood. So the closest thing we have is probably Christopher Nolan to someone who's got free creative reign because they have their own studio that can be an auteur. Do I think he's as good as Hayao Miyazaki? No. But I think in terms of like what he's putting forward in terms of like sincerity and earnestness as well, I think he's kind of doing it in a different way. But I think that, it's pretty hard to get something that is so inherently just from one person's view, which I think it seems like Hayao Miyazaki's are. So obviously, those who don't know, auteur theory it means it's just if someone is given complete creative control over a project that's their own. So usually in terms of filmmaking, directors, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And just another couple of quotes to help sort of bring this point home. So one of the main reasons that Miyazaki makes films is he says, in order to grow your audience, you must betray their expectations. So surprise, right? And like subverting an audience expectation is obviously key to telling good stories. Another thing I find really interesting, and this will lead me to my next point, but he says, the creation of a single world comes from a huge number of fragments and chaos. And this leads me to the fact that Studio Ghibli is very, very famous for soft world building, right? Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, basically, we did talk about this in our first episode, but again, 4 years ago.
No one has listened to that episode.
I know no one listened to that episode, but I'm just, I know.
Forget about it.
All right, forget it. Forget that episode exists. No, but soft world building versus hard world building, right? So essentially, a hard world build, a good example of that, Lord of the Rings, right? Hard world builders you'll ever find, okay? Tolkien wrote a whole fucking language, literal language of Elvish, and he's got the, what are they called? The there's other Eldoridiums or whatever the fuck they're called. The whole compendiums of the world, which came after, he spent years writing compendiums of like hard lore, Lore, of these worlds, right? And then the characters exist within those worlds, okay? That's a good example of a hard world build. Soft world build, Studio Ghibli. Also, Harry Potter, soft-ass world build. And I would argue, interesting with Harry Potter is that it starts as a soft world build and then progressively gets into a harder world build, which actually causes it problems as the books and movies go along. Because all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, what? Anyway, we could talk about that as a whole episode.
In fact, we did argue about this before, so I remember now. What is it because it's set in... No, it's because she made a lot of like retcon decisions.
Massive retcon decisions, and like all of a sudden it's like, now this thing existed. You're like, what?
But can you have a hard world build that's something like in, for example, Harry Potter set in the modern world, in the current world, in the 90s when she wrote it, and then it's like the world is a secret world beyond our world, like Narnia, that kind of thing. I guess Narnia is a hard world build, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's a good question. But like a lot of the hard world build, soft world build stuff came from sci-fi, hard sci-fi, soft world build sci-fi. Well, here's a good example of something really upsetting a fan base. Midichlorians. Right? I would argue that Star Wars, again, not my field, so don't come for me, but I would argue Star Wars probably a softer world build. Now, not as soft as Ghibli. Now, what I mean by this, again...
And also, just to clarify, soft world build, hard, they don't necessarily mean good and bad in terms of
not
storytelling.
In the slightest.
There are some awful hard world builds out there.
Awful soft world builds, too.
Yes, but they're really good. It just is a kind of to define the world build.
It doesn't mean lazy. Now, that's when people start to get upset. Like that's the thing. It's like not a lazy world build. I would never argue that Miyazaki's worlds are lazy, but so much of what Miyazaki builds is not explained. It doesn't need Elvish written out in compendiums for me to understand. It's like, for example, let's just give a really clear, easy example. Spirited Away, those of you who have seen it. Baba Yaga has a rule where if you ask her for a job, she has to give it to you. Why? It doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't matter. It just is. These rules are just there, and the fact of the matter is...
I love that, because the main character, the protagonist who we're seeing the eyes of, would not fucking know the answer to that question unless she actively sought out the answer. And she's too busy trying to save her fucking parents and trying to figure out what the fuck's going on to be like, hang on, can you just explain why this
just take 5.
Just take 5 to go and get deep on this.
Is there a seminar that I missed that's going to explain what's going on here?
But this happens all the time. Now it's in Miyazaki films, because as a result of the soft world build, it doesn't really matter about the specific rules of the world. Therefore, you can focus on character, right? Because it's a character's journey within this world, as opposed to a world informing what the character does, right? Now, that's not, I mean, of course, the world informs that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
100%. And I mean, the one other thing I'd add to that, because you're right, it frees it up to be character driven, and and Miyazaki speaks at length about, you can tell I've watched some YouTube. You can tell that I've spent many an hour gleaning what I can from this man hunched over his drawing table on the other side of the world. He'll say things like, characters are driven by their will, and you have to follow the will of the character. And like, that's not so different from the usual parlance of like, you have to follow the one. What does the character want? How do they hit the obstacle? But what he's saying here is that there's something more vital and alive within the character that he's following.
Yes.
The thing I'd say about Miyazaki's soft world build, and through the lens of why I feel like his storytelling is so nourishing and so singular, I think on a deep level, when you watch Miyazaki, and sorry, this is connected to this idea of his films being driven by sincerity of purpose, emotion, and the personal, giving himself room through process for all of that to just explode out of this single germ. This idea that when you're watching a Miyazaki film, it almost feels like you're watching a dream.
Yes.
Like consider if I told you that I had this dream where I was driving with my parents and then we like randomly went into this carnival and then they started eating and turned into pigs. And so I ran away and then I ended up at a bathhouse, but you'd be like, dude, that's a cooked dream, you know, like
that's wild.
And what Miyazaki accesses routinely in this soft, what we might define as a soft world build, is this kind of unconscious symbolism.
Yes.
That his films are full of things like ruins and great trees and these really rich symbols that, you know, Joseph Conrad might refer to as things that connect to the monomyth or whatever. But to me, again, in my opinion, Miyazaki is using the building block of myth, and we recognize in these things these undercurrents. And so part of that has to do with clearly the Shinto influence and other stuff. But in not thinking about external stuff, in letting it just come from deep within his own emotions and experiences, I think without meaning to, he's tapping into these unconscious images. Like, for example, in Spirited Away, when they're driving, when the train is on the train tracks and it's under a little bit of ocean, you know, and just the as above, so below imagery of that, Princess Mononoke, full of like all these things that it's just playing on this. And again, this is Mountains Through the Mist. This is Einstein stuff. He's just playing a whole different game, you know, that like even in these little details, he's inviting, by so earnestly inviting you into the individual, you see the everything. And I know this is getting woo, but this is why he's my hero, because it so connects to the purest things that story can do.
Absolutely. And to bring it back on another quote, there are more profound things than simply logic that guide the creation of the story. And Miyazaki said that in reference to the train scene of Spirited Away. Because again, if you wanted to get all like, why is that train there? How is it doing this? Why does it come at this time? Why does it only come twice a day? Why does that lamp hop? The way he builds these worlds, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting about it.
It just creates free imagination in that way as well, which is like one of the main factors I think it makes Ghibli so special, and I feel like is the imaginative aspects of the world builds. I find it interesting talking about like processing, because a lot of this is the one that I find the most fascinating is Howl's Moving Castle is adapted from a book, right? And a lot of them are actually adaptations of texts or novels. Like
but not manga.
No,
well, like, sometimes, but very rarely.
Very rarely, but like it's so it's funny that his process is so like open-ended. Howl's Moving Castle, the book, and the movie, Chalk and Cheese, they're completely so different. I love both of them. I'm like a weird Diana Wynne Jones stan for no one like why, but I love that fucking book so much, and I love Howl in that book. They're completely different, but it's a testament as a Howl's Moving Castle book stan that I went, fuck, Ghibli's is just as good in a completely different way, because it doesn't even. They're saying completely different things. They are completely different. The only thing that's there is the characters and the bare bones, which is like girl gets turned into old woman, has to seek refuge in this like evil wizard's castle moving house. Sorry, it is in fact
Howl's Moving House.
Oh, God. But
just a 4-bedroom up downstairs. The Sydney moving townhouse.
Heaps of mold.
Got to call his mate to be like, bro, can you come help me out, man? I really need you. I can't afford the removalists.
It's just Sam carrying a fridge by himself down some stairs, which I have seen in life. It was ill-advised then.
It was ill-advised then. It's crazy now. But
but adapting novels into that and literally just being like, no, I'm just going to do the complete opposite of what this novel is saying and still come out with something that is wonderful and not annoy any of the book stands is a superpower in itself, one would say.
Well, it's also interesting because when I was doing my master's, I was doing Asian popular culture, and a lot of reading I got to do was about Osamu Tezuka, obviously, as many people say, the godfather of anime, especially modern anime and televised anime, which is bring about this whole system. It's because of how Astro Boy was made, how he had to get it made was by essentially running a system which is still in place today, which we've talked about this a lot, is actively detrimental, not only to the industry, but to the people who work within it, right? It's just one of those things which is incredibly exploitative. People have to work incredibly hard, and there's bugger all money from those outside of the production committee. I'm not going to get into production committees now, but you can find our old podcast, How an Anime is Made in the Big Production Studios, where I talk about that. But Miyazaki and Tezuka were at war. There's a lot of academic texts about this.
Interesting. I don't know this.
Yeah. So a lot of Miyazaki did not like Tezuka at all. He thought what Tezuka was doing was detrimental to art. And it's very, very interesting this, because as you look at this, the way that anime is made week to week in the 4 seasonal structure in which we have it, it is just like grind. It is get it out, work 18-hour days, don't sleep, don't go home, sleep under your desk, get it done. We have a strict, and they're adapting from manga, 80% of the time. And whereas Miyazaki is just like, it's going to draw a picture and see what happens, man. Now, don't get me wrong, the man works harder than anybody else.
Yeah,
so he's an
yeah.
absolute machine, but
Yeah.
it's different. So he still has that mentality with him, but the process is so much more free and so much more exploratory, right? And he did this in response to what he saw Tezuka doing to the industry.
Yeah.
This is why he
that's
did it.
fascinating.
It is really interesting. It's something I'd like to get more into. Again, I need to do more reading on the topic. And if those of you out there who know more about it, please comment, because I'm going to dive deeper into it. But it's fascinating that is what he did in response to what he saw the industry going into.
Yeah,
right?
it's just interesting though, because I feel like you can argue that obviously Miyazaki makes movies, and
Of course,
if you
different.
have like serialized TV anime, that they're just completely different beasts.
They are.
Yeah, so I don't know.
It definitely seems like Miyazaki's got massive contempt for almost all modern anime.
Oh, yeah.
On the record saying as much.
You don't think he was hyped for the latest episode of Demon Slayer?
I mean,
But when Koyomi came in and knocked
It was
his head
so
off.
cool though.
I would love to sit down and watch it with him. But although the last people that, probably the most famous people to sit down and watch something with Miyazaki were these AI developers that went into Studio Ghibli to show him generated images and generated animation. And he opened by saying, I think this is an insult against life itself, and proceeded to absolutely ruin these people's day. I personally, I don't think he's wrong, and certainly like you can't. Like, who thought that was a good idea to bring in like computer generated or AI generated images to the man that spends, will throw out drawings because he hasn't gotten the way a hair on a caterpillar moves properly, so he doesn't feel like he's honoring life itself. What's worth mentioning from like a broader filmmaking context, which is that this process that he chooses to put everything on his own shoulders and to make this world revolve around him would crush 99.9% of people.
Oh, yeah.
Like we've all in different ways worked in film or have seen like the way film works. Like it is horrendous, the stress that people deal with.
Hardest working people you'll meet, man.
And like honestly, like to have that much pressure raining on something that you are creating as you go, because again, this isn't like this is how I'm going to get to my first draft and we'll go from there. It's like, no, he starts and then the train leaves behind him. He's got a team of animators that are already going with the direction that he has led. It is all on him to land the plane, and that would crush most people. And the fact that it hasn't crushed him and that he goes back and back and back and back is wild to me.
It is. So now we'll dive a bit into structure, story structure, and something that is different inherently, which is, of course, Kishotenketsu.
Yep.
Now, Gerald, can you please explain to people what Kishotenketsu is?
So Kishotenketsu is essentially the like Eastern structure of storytelling. And so you're like, what do you mean by Eastern? It's like, well, without realizing, we've all been conditioned into the Western style of storytelling, which is very single protagonist, hero's journey, characters that are on a journey to change, and we're going to learn a lesson as a consequence of that. And
3-act structure.
And the conflict is always rising, and the highest point of drama in a story will be the climax and all the rest of it, right? So Kishotenketsu is a 4-act and Eastern structure. It's present in early Chinese texts, epic Korean poetry, and is also a key part of stories as they've been told in Japan over the years. The biggest difference between it, in a functional level, is the way that it takes the emphasis off conflict. And so in the Western storytelling canon, like without even really like having to go in details, we all know that feeling of just like go, go, go. Things happen. Conflict. Characters scramble to solve problems, and like it makes a lot of sense because we all know that feeling when a story slows down that little bit too much and things get static and you get bored and all the rest of it, right? But Kishotenketsu and like has a whole new way of coming at it, which is far more of a slice of life approach, and it's why Japan does slice of life anime as best, like everything that we love, you know, like Skip and Loafer would be nothing without Kishotenketsu. You know, and so it is this other art of taking the conflict and the driving, rising, you know, escalating stakes and all the rest of it away and being like, no, we're going to bank on you being interested enough in these characters and this hook. And one of the things that make Studio Ghibli films feel so different to Western audiences is the way, and especially in the front half of films, all of a sudden characters are just doing things. So like, for example, Howl's Moving Castle, one of my faves, she gets turned into an old lady. And in the Western version, she'd be like, struggle to solve this problem. In the first half of that film, she's like, well, I live in a castle now. I better do some cleaning, you know, better have a relationship with this little boy. And like slowly the film, you know, but that...
She's literally like, you know what? This suits me fine.
Yeah.
Like, she's like, I think being an old lady actually suits my inner personality more. And she just rolls with it.
And the film is no poorer for it.
It's great.
You know?
No.
She could not care less about being turned that young. That's not her mission, really.
Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas like, you know, something like The Wizard of Oz, obviously it's like, gotta get home as fast as possible.
That's it.
Yeah, what a waste.
What a waste.
Yeah,
Hang out with
you
the
want to
Munchkins,
go back to
dude.
Kansas in the
Kansas,
1920s?
bro, the 20s. It's a
fucking
horrible
hell.
place to be,
I mean,
man. You're in a fantastical world with Tin Men and
Stop
dancing
running
scarecrows.
away from the flying monkeys, you know, like
They're
what
the
a
coolest.
fascinating thing to see.
Also, we've talked about this, but she's the villain of the story.
Yes.
Oh, big time.
Crushes someone with a house and it's like taking your shoes, bitch.
Like,
They say terrible things about her when she leaves. Yeah.
that was a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
But interestingly, so if that's like the Japanese standard and a lot of you know, Miyazaki's films live in that space. In recent time, he's even drifted away from that, you know, because then, so he's alienated some audience even in Japan because they, in the same way we expect 3-act single protagonist structure, they're going, like this isn't, you know, syncing up the way that we thought. And he's just transcended structure and no poorer for it, you know, and this again missed through the mountains because that process can only happen when you are so connected to your story on a personal, emotional level that you're discovering as you go, and you have faith that the sum of all of the interesting things you're doing will hold attention.
Yes.
The one additional thing that I do want to talk about in terms of Miyazaki and structure, and another thing that he's famous for is, and connected to this idea of slice of life and quiet moments and restful moments. He had a famous interview with the late great Roger Ebert, the film critic. Ebert brought up these quiet moments, whether it's A Little Girl on the Train or the Umbrella in the Rain, or my favorite one in Howl's Moving Castle, where they have a little picnic looking up at the mountains. And just like, oh.
Is that when Turnip Head is like got the thing across and he's doing like, he's like a washing line?
Yeah,
at
the
some
drying the
really
washing. And
Thanks, Gerald.
Miyazaki essentially says, that's there on purpose, you know, and he calls that ma, and he proceeds to clap them into you, and he indicates that the space between the clap is ma. And again, and this is like why I'm so in awe of Miyazaki, that all Western storytelling puts this real focus on driving action. It's got to be go, go, go. Because as I said, like the worst thing that can happen is the audience gets bored and things get static. And so that takes the focus away from the gap between these beats. You know, the Nolans of the world are defined by what is the coolest thing that the Joker can do in this moment. Miyazaki has defined himself by what is the most I can make you feel when there's nothing going on.
Yes.
And it's just this revolutionary idea that, and so you go, okay, well, that sounds simple. Just put some rests, you know, in your story. But like, no, because the nourishing life that he's able to capture in these moments is, if nothing else, the evidence of that singular mind. Because if normal theory is that character is revealed through action, he reveals them in these quiet moments of doing nothing. Another really amazing one. Porco Rosso in Milan steps out of the shed to smoke a cigarette, look around, he sees the girl working his plane through the window, throws it in the river and goes back in. But Miyazaki talks about opening another door, another dimension into the story and the way that it lets it breathe. The final thing I'll say on this, sorry, you've unzipped me on like, just tell me to shut up when you've heard enough.
That's great.
It's great, mate.
There's a great lecture called How to Write a Movie that Craig Mazin gave an Austin screenwriting summit once, and you'll know Mazin from Chernobyl, The Last of Us.
Yep.
Scary
The Hangover
5.
Part
Scary
2.
Movie 5, The Hangover.
Yeah.
And he talks about this idea that we're always like recognizing if stories are taking you from this version of disordered order, and we've got to recognize a character and their journey and blah, blah, blah. The most we recognize a character is in their moment of being lost, when their old way is past, but you haven't quite figured out what the new way is, and you're just kind of struggling in this quiet way. And it kind of mirrors what we were saying before about this idea of we know that life is cruel. We know that the laugh of life is cruel and hard. But at the same time, we hope that the light will shine on us and there will be some meaning and a way to reconcile and all the things. And it's in these moments of characters being lost that we most recognize them. Storytellers usually use that at what they'd call the end of a second act beat, the low, before I've learned the lesson, it's time to change. Miyazaki leverages this energy in these moments of ma. When they're sitting out looking at those mountains with Turnip Head behind them and the lion, like that's a character lost, but choosing in that moment to struggle in a sublime moment in nature. When she's on the train with no face, quietly reflecting on the journey, to be like that's a character that's lost, and you're so Porco Rosso smoking, and you can only sell a mind or audiences' minds that have been so trained to detect artifice. You can only get them to buy that if you have all in on purpose, all in on emotion, all in on why it is personal to you, Yes. I hope I'm doing a good job of expressing that these things sound so simple, but the commitment that you have to have and the authenticity you need to have to make them sing is singular, mist through the mountain.
The hardest thing to achieve is simple.
Yeah.
Because you can throw 100%. As many different things on top of something as you want, but the hardest thing is to make the most simple and basic fascinating, and which it is.
And because a lot of these films do have like great action moments, and
absolutely,
most of them have war, but like it's that's not the thing that I remember now you mentioning it. Like if I think back at those movies, if I think Spirited Away, I think Train, I think like those truly do capture the essence.
Yeah. And it's interesting that these moments of Ma that we remember are also often that germ, that first thing that he thought of to build everything from. And so again, like to go back to this idea of nourishing and to like, stories is playing this fundamental role with us. Think about in our lives how much screen time we actually do. And even great entertaining story. I've watched seasons of anime that I freaking love, but it leaves me feeling drained.
Mm-hmm.
You never feel drained watching a Miyazaki film.
No.
Go and watch one and watch yourself watching it and watch how you feel. You never feel less than when you watch a Miyazaki film, and see if you can point to anything else in life that can do that.
It brings me to when we're talking about how he's kind of adjusted again his own narrative style in terms of, we'll talk about The Boy and the Heron, which is the latest release that just won the Oscar. This film actually, although obviously great critical acclaim, a lot of people were divided on it. And I think it's because it felt a bit different to how we're used to kind of Miyazaki films. I personally think it might be my favorite.
Wow.
So it's an interesting kind of conversation to have, where the first half of that film might be the first instance in which I say it might be hard to watch a Ghibli film, because you're dealing with such like an intense look at a little boy's trauma and grief in a way that you kind of, it goes on for a while, and they make you sit with that for a long time before you get the second half of the film or the next bit, which is in the imaginative world.
You're right. Like struggle and crisis and the visceral authenticity that are features of all of his work, but yeah, you're right. It makes you sit with it in this one. You're like, okay, turn the corner, and it just takes a while. Yeah.
And it's a film that has generated a lot of debate. Maybe it's just because I did that review and a lot of people are debating in the comments. And I think it's valid. I think there's a lot of valid points about it, and people have read that film entirely differently as well. And when I was first watching it, I remember thinking in the cinema, am I enjoying this? And then had a beer, and then suddenly it clicked for me. And I was talking to my partner, and we were just kind of going, hang on, no, I think I know what he's trying to say here. And then it became, in hindsight, one of my favorites. I watched it again, and I think it's kind of sitting there, and obviously we're talking about a lot of his films we haven't actually brushed on how autobiographical a lot of his movies are, and everything.
Wind Rises is about his father, essentially.
But every film he does, we've talked about this before,
his mother and a few seminal moments.
And the planes, obviously, every obsession with the World War II.
It's because his father ran a warehouse which built airplane engines, I think.
Which is all throughout all the films. That this felt like, for me, particularly once we got to the actual world, which is, you could read it as just like a metaphor for this kid's grief, which it probably is.
Yeah.
But it's a tower. Sorry, anyway. It's fine.
We're back on towers.
Sort of a tower. Yeah.
Did you listen to our last episode?
Yeah.
We're all about towers.
We love towers. But I
need
think
to see the Charlie top 10 tower rankings. But we'll save that for another day. Yeah.
Next YouTube video. Check it out on Patreon now.
honestly, I'm here for that. But I do think that world, to me, was just filled with so much homage to past worlds that he has created. And obviously, a lot of the films have visual cues that are similar in design. You know when you're looking at a Hayao Miyazaki film. And I think to me, there was just like, it seemed to me like just a nod to so many different things. Like every shot, I was like, that looks like the cottage from House of Castle, or like, oh, and now we're in the Ponyo storm. And like it kind of, and then when it came to and I don't want to spoil the ending of the movie though, so I won't get into it. But then when it comes to like him talking to his uncle and that conversation, that was when it really hit home for me that that's what that movie was actually all about. It's about passing the torch to the younger generation. And do you take this from me, it's my legacy, or do you come up with your own thing? And do you, like, it's actually the whole thing about artistic, I think it's a brilliant film.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And had a likewise, went in expecting to have my feelings blown away. I was like, I've had a rough week, Miyazaki, make me believe again. And then you walk out of it and you're like, oh, that was more complicated than I was expecting. It's a really great New Yorker piece, remiss, I can't remember who wrote it, about that film. And they talk about how the currency of care exists in Miyazaki films. And normally these characters go into these other worlds, express care, get care back. He goes into this world, is not like soothed by it in any which way. And as you say, like having this encounter, we won't ruin the end. But for me, to Yasin, what you're saying there, if all of his rest of his films have been like, if you care for others, if you stand up to the things that need to be stood up to, if you do all these humanist things, you can change and things will be better and you can feel good. And this film was a lot more through that, for me, at my interpretation, a lot more, sometimes life is shit and you cop some slings and arrows and you feel the grief of that, and you can either sit in the grief of it or you can move on, For the rest of his films have been kindly Miyazaki granddad. This was just like tough love Miyazaki, just kind of being like, you got to get on with it. And you could feel his own, did you feel his own conflict about the role that he's played? Yeah,
I think so. I think that was like the main thing. It's just like, I've built this thing and I'm known for this person, but like this shouldn't be like, people shouldn't just try and replicate that necessarily. Yeah. And it's like, it's all about kind of I thought it was quite a generous message actually for him to be like, I don't know.
Well, it's also interesting because in the West it's entitled The Boy and the Heron, but in Japan it's entitled How Do You Live?
Yeah.
And not just that, but there's a quote from him when he was making it. He made it for his grandson, by the way. And it was basically saying to him, Grandpa is moving on to the next world soon, but he's leaving this film behind because he loves you. That was his big reason for making this film, right? And that's very, very interesting hearing you both speak about that and how he's come to a different conclusion than we all. Again, what has he done? He's subverted our expectations.
It was surprising.
Miyazaki, you son of a bitch. Like he's still doing it, and that is the making or the markings of an incredible filmmaker. That he can still, after all this time, your favorite filmmaker of all time, can still subvert your expectation like that. Yeah. Is whether or not you necessarily liked it or not is almost irrelevant, because it's like he's still making art at 80 odd. Yeah. We can only dream of doing such a thing, right?
There'll never be a book that tells you how to make a Miyazaki film. There'll never be an AI that can do it the same way. Like, we may never see another individual allowed to work this process just properly singular, and there's this rush to try and perfectly understand and analyze and to go full circle. Part of me really resists that, like, let the mountains be obscured by the mist, like let it hold on to its beautiful personal unknown. And I think he as a filmmaker does such a good job of that. And he never gives too much. He only gives just enough. He never tells you how to feel. Lets a little bit of like self-loathing slip. Quickly, packages that back away. I think we're all just very, very lucky to have been able to, experience it.
Just very quickly, my favorite Ghibli film is indeed Kiki's Delivery Service. And I think the reason for it being my favorite is that it is really about nothing. There's almost no antagonistic moments in that whole film. It's just a simple coming of age story. I mean, the really upsetting part is that the cat stops talking to her. That's devastating.
Yeah,
okay,
so
that's what kills
horrible.
me. Except in the English dub, Gigi does. Wrong. In the sub, doesn't speak again.
Interesting.
But Phil Hartman, who does the voice, does come back and speak to her in the last scene. In the subtitle version, when the Japanese only version, does not speak to her again.
Really?
Yep, big thing. Really interesting. Yeah. Anyway, my point that I'm laboring here is that my favorite film of all of Studio Ghibli is literally the most simple. Of course, it's about witches. Okay, it's not like no Studio Ghibli is like basic. I mean, some of Takahata's films are far more grounded in realism. And one of the great things I heard about Kishotenketsu is that it has a kind of wandering quality to it.
Yeah.
And that is such a wandering film. You know, like she just wanders through this, fantastic world. And again, talking about soft world building, she's a witch and every town has a witch. Why? Shut up. Doesn't matter. Just is. And you just go, cool. Yes. Great. Now tell me, what's she doing? What's she all about? And just trying to find her way in life. It's such a beautiful film. I couldn't love it much more if I tried. I just think it's so fantastic. And literally nothing happens. Like such few things happen. And that to me is the true beauty of Miyazaki. But then you look at something like Mononoke, everything happens. But at the same time, it's his longest film as well. Leonardo DiCaprio's favorite film of all time, by the way. But just...
Thank God I know that now.
Yeah.
Fun fact.
If we bump into him, we'll have something to talk about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when you're in LA.
He won't give me the time of day. I'm too old.
You're too old. Yeah, you're washed.
Sorry. Made that joke way too many times. This podcast.
But I just think the sheer breadth, and even when he's doing the most, like in Mononoke, where it's epic nature versus modernity and almost war-like finale, it's still the it's the moments in between that are the most beautiful, like the moments with him and Mononoke. Like those moments just hanging out in the forest, seeing the beauty and majesty of nature are the things that I remember most. And the creepy little, forest creatures, like just, them walking through the swamps. That's what I remember more than the huge war stuff with Lady Eboshi and the forest spirit and all that. Like, it's just, he's doing something so different and so unique. And you're right. No one will ever replicate it. No AI will ever make it again. And they'll try. But there's something very uniquely human about it. Yeah. And that's what's so special, right?
As a kind of final thought about like his devotion to capturing that life and to respecting the living, the way that he teaches and trains his animators to draw has such a obsessive focus on observing life, observing the mundane, celebrating the life and specialness that lives in the mundane, and capturing that truthfully, and that this is someone that so much angst has been experienced trying to find that life on the page. What's your favorite, Julie, very quickly, Charlie?
Boy and the Heron, but I also think before that, I actually don't think it's the best one. I think Howl's Moving Castle has a special place in my heart, but I don't think it's his best movie by any stretch. But I do think, look, I'm so basic. I'm like, the two that won the Oscars, it's Spirited Away.
Spirited Away is an incredible film.
Yeah.
Yours, Gerald?
Obviously obsessed with all of them, but I'll say like my favorite B-side one. My favorite B-side one's Porco Rosso.
Yeah.
Porco Rosso's great.
Love that movie. Soft world build. He's a pig, and no one ever brings that up again, aside from to be like, when are you going to get rid of this curse, Marco? And just a brilliant, perfect Kishotenketsu is like, he's a pig who's a bounty hunter. Here is him being a pig who's a bounty hunter. The Italian police are after him now. He's going to fight an American, and we're done. And in between, just like the most beautiful renderings of life in the Adriatic, a very tender story about the guilt of war survivors, and again just these beautiful unconscious imageries that stay with you. There's a particular image of Porco Rosso high up above the clouds, and him just seeing planes of all of the war dead and just like drifting in this like never-ending current of human life expressed the way a plane. And you're like, well, I'm never forgetting that image.
It's incredible.
It's fantastic.
We could literally sit here and do this for 10 hours, but we must bring this to an end. Thank you so much, everyone. Gerald, thank you so much for sharing your passion and your knowledge of Miyazaki. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak on these things.
It's useful and interesting. Yeah.
Indeed. No, thank you so much. Charlie, thank you as well. Always a good time to chat about one of our favorite filmmakers and someone who has literally transcended the boundaries of anime and what anime has been perceived as.
Yeah, but to me, it's so Japanese as well. Like, there's so
Yeah.
like,
That's the most unique part about it, is that it's so universal yet so Japanese.
Yeah, I think people.
That's the special part of it. And it's just transcended what people consider anime to be. And to the point where I think it is just the only piece, even by Pokemon and whatever, may be slightly different because it's so universal and like kind of like, you know, not accepted as like anime in the same way that like Demon Slayer is so obviously anime, Jujutsu Kaisen, you know, all these things. It's just doing something so different and it's so incredibly universal. And I think that will be something that is maybe never done again by anybody. No. I hope someone does. But yes. Anyway, thank you all so much for joining us. We always appreciate it. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Please watch us on YouTube, subscribe, and like. If you are a listener, please go and give us a review on Apple and or Spotify. It really does make a big difference. 5 stars does actually help because it is a funny old system. We would really appreciate you all coming over to Patreon if you want to hear some more content from us. We're going to be doing a little extra episode where we talk about our favorite Hashiras because Demon Slayer is a thing at the moment. So head on over there if you want to follow us there. It really does make a massive, massive difference. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been our deep dive into Studio Ghibli and the storytelling of Miyazaki. Gerald and Charlie, thank you so much. We'll catch you next time. All the best.